They thought she was harmless, invisible even, a quiet woman behind a desk with nothing but a calendar, a coffee mug, and an outdated computer. Nobody suspected that behind those thick glasses and gentle smile was a mind sharper than any weapon on the battlefield. But when the nation faced its darkest hour, and the lives of 1,000 soldiers hung by a thread, the only person capable of turning the tide wasn't a general, a spy, or a strategist. It was her, the woman they had called just a secretary. This is the story of how Elise Navarro broke through firewalls, defied chain of command, and rewrote history from a forgotten corner of a government office. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started on an ordinary Monday in a government building most people passed by without a second glance. The Ministry of Tactical Logistics, tucked between rows of drab concrete offices, was the kind of place where paperwork mattered more than people. Elise Navarro had been there for nearly 8 years, her daily routine so predictable that even the motion sensor lights barely flickered when she walked in. She arrived at precisely 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the building opened, wearing a pressed beige blouse and navy skirt, her hair pinned up in the same efficient bun. Her ID badge, worn and laminated, clipped firmly to her collar, and a soft hum of morning greetings floated from her lips to the empty hallway as she made her way to room B107. Room B107 wasn't impressive. A few gray filing cabinets, a clunky metal desk, and a battered Lenovo laptop from 2015 made up her entire domain. A fake ficus plant drooped in the corner. Her title was Administrative Technical Secretary, Level 2. A title so vague, even the cleaning staff weren't sure what she did. To the outside world, she was a cog in the machinery, someone to print schedules, book flights for executives, and answer phones with practiced politeness. But Elise liked it that way. She listened, she observed, she quietly watched how the world moved around her, how things connected, how patterns emerged in the mess of bureaucracy. What they didn't know, what no one bothered to ask, was that Elise had once been accepted to an elite cybersecurity program, but dropped out to take care of her dying mother. What they didn't know was that while she filed budget memos and fetched coffee for department heads, she was also monitoring strange data inconsistencies in a system nobody even remembered existed. And what they absolutely didn't know was that she had built her own encrypted monitoring tools on her personal drive, tools that would later detect the very breach that could have killed 1,000 soldiers on foreign ground. But that came later. On this particular day, Elise was just beginning her morning ritual. She flipped on her desktop, input her 16-character password, and sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos engraved with "World's Okayest Assistant," a gift from a retiring colleague. She glanced over a daily log report from the satellite communications network that her office maintained, even though they had long since outsourced monitoring to private contractors. It was part of the department's outdated system, a relic from older times. Most people ignored the logs. Elise didn't. In fact, she'd written a script 2 years ago that color-coded anomalies in real time. That morning, something pinged red. She paused. Only once before had she seen a red ping. It was a glitch caused by overlapping IP addresses from a training server, completely harmless. But this one was different. It wasn't an address overlap. It was an unauthorized outbound data stream. It originated from a node tied to a military outpost near the northern border, a communications station that had, on record, been inactive for months. Elise's brow furrowed. She double-checked the protocol signature, ran a checksum comparison, and confirmed what her gut had already told her. Someone had breached the system. And they were using old, forgotten infrastructure as a tunnel. Most people would have reported it. Elise didn't. Instead, she opened an unlisted console terminal she had built into her work computer, a ghost system embedded beneath layers of spreadsheets and employee training schedules. Through this, she traced the data stream. It wasn't just leaking data. It was rerouting command signals. Whoever was on the other end wasn't just watching. They were preparing to control something. The implications hit her like a punch in the gut. Troop positions, supply chain paths, timing of resource drops, all the logistics that funneled through the outdated system Elise babysat like a fossil, they were being hijacked. Whoever was behind this breach was aiming to reroute a crucial convoy of medical supplies and personnel scheduled to move through a volatile zone in 24 hours. If the convoy went through the rerouted path, they would enter a trap. And no one knew, no one but Elise. She stared at the screen. Her hands trembled slightly, but she took a slow breath and steadied them. Reporting it up the chain would take hours. The incident would get buried under layers of protocol, bureaucracy, and blame. By then, it would be too late. The enemy would be ready. The soldiers would be exposed. Lives would be lost. So Elise Navarro, the woman everyone dismissed as just a secretary, made a decision. She picked up her coffee, took one long sip, and minimized the spreadsheet interface. Her eyes sharpened as she leaned in and began typing rapidly into the ghost console. The system still had buried administrative access codes. She had found them years ago and filed them under obsolete, but now they were her only shot. She would intercept the breach herself. She would rewrite the route. She would neutralize the tunnel. She didn't have a badge of authority, or a team, or a clearance level high enough to breathe in the room where these decisions were made. But she had a mind trained to see patterns others missed, and she had just 24 hours to stop 1,000 lives from walking into a death trap. Elise Navarro had never stood out in a room, and she had no desire to. In meetings, she sat 2 chairs from the end, kept her voice even and agreeable, and scribbled notes with the efficiency of someone who memorized details no one else noticed. Her hair was always tied back in that no-nonsense bun. Her clothes were tidy but forgettable, and her walk was measured, soft-footed. To most, she was background noise in an already quiet office. But if one had watched closely, they'd notice how her eyes missed nothing, how they flicked over monitors and hallway interactions, how she subtly tracked who entered which rooms, who sent which emails, who lingered too long in conversations they weren't meant to hear. Elise lived in a state of quiet awareness, and it wasn't because she wanted gossip. It was because she had learned that the world rarely saw you coming if it never saw you at all. Born and raised in a quiet part of Vermont, Elise had been a prodigy of sorts. At 13, she dismantled the firewall of her local library's network just to prove to her computer science teacher that the school's filter settings were poorly configured. At 15, she was writing basic cryptographic functions for a college research lab. But while other young talents applied to tech academies and launched apps for startup dreams, Elise had been tending to her mother, who had grown weak and confused too early, with an illness that shrank her world by the week. Elise had stayed, declining scholarships, opting instead for night courses in cybersecurity while working days as a receptionist at a civil engineering firm. By 22, she could have easily passed certification for top-tier clearance, but caregiving didn't allow for sudden job shifts or long interviews. She chose stability. And that's how she landed, somewhat quietly, into government work, where predictability paid the bills and her brilliance could stay politely hidden. Her first role at the Ministry of Tactical Logistics had been a contract position, clerical, mostly forms and scheduling. But within a year, Elise had automated most of her own job. She created spreadsheet macros that shaved hours off workload, reorganized filing systems by logic trees only she fully understood, and quietly added backup redundancy to vulnerable communications logs no one else had looked at since 2004. Managers noticed, if only briefly. They nodded, thanked her, gave her new forms to fill. But Elise never asked for more. That wasn't her nature. She had long accepted that some gifts were best used quietly. Behind her quiet presence was a mind constantly at work. At home, she built custom hardware firewalls for fun, reviewed open-source vulnerabilities like others read novels, and simulated cyber attacks on retired government software to test outdated vulnerabilities. Not because anyone asked her to, but because it helped her sleep at night. In a world increasingly defined by invisible threats and blinking cursors, Elise believed in being prepared. And even though her official job title had never risen beyond Level 2 Technical Secretary, she knew she was capable of more. She just wasn't interested in waiting for someone else's permission to prove it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite her abilities, Elise wasn't cynical. She believed in order, in systems working the way they should. That's why she'd stayed, why she hadn't walked out and chased some high-paying role in the private sector. She believed that one person could still make a difference in a place as bloated and overlooked as the ministry. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was better to be the ghost in the machine, the silent safeguard in a forgotten office, than a flashy name in a spotlight. There was, of course, a cost to that kind of invisibility. Elise had no close friends at the ministry. She was friendly, always professional, but no one knew what music she liked or what books she read or how she spent her weekends. Her cubicle had no family photos, no colorful mugs, or sticky notes with inside jokes. When coworkers gathered for birthdays in the break room, Elise would stop by briefly, offer a polite smile, and return to her tasks. It wasn't loneliness. Not exactly. It was distance, a buffer she had learned to keep between herself and a world that didn't quite know what to do with someone like her. Still, she was far from cold. When the janitor's son needed help setting up his university laptop, Elise fixed the driver issue before the boy even explained it. When the IT team struggled with a backup issue after a power outage, Elise handed them a flash drive with a patch she had written the year before, just in case. She gave away her wins freely, never attached her name, never asked for thanks. She just wanted things to work. Quietly. Reliably. So when the red ping lit up her screen that morning, Elise didn't panic. Her breath slowed, her eyes narrowed, and her mind began mapping. There was no dramatic music in her head, no swelling urgency. Just calculations, timetables, access logs, protocol loopholes. She cataloged everything like she always had, moving pieces on the invisible board that only she saw. She was just a secretary to everyone around her. A background figure in a world of uniforms and mission briefings, but inside her, beneath the calm face and soft voice, lived an arsenal of knowledge built from years of discipline, grief, and restless intellect. And now, the world had unknowingly placed its faith in her hands, not because they believed in her, but because they had no idea she was even there. Elise Navarro had spent years being underestimated. It would be their greatest mistake. The Ministry of Tactical Logistics was a misnomer in every way. The word tactical implied strategy, movement, purpose. The building, however, was inert, a 5-story concrete block on the edge of a fading government district. It looked less like a hub of critical defense coordination and more like a forgotten library with no books. The outer facade was streaked with years of rain and smog, and inside, fluorescent lights buzzed unevenly in corridors that smelled faintly of ink, dust, and old paper. The air conditioning wheezed in cycles, creating a soundscape of mild discomfort that was only broken by the occasional clack of heels or the low murmur of hallway conversations. The walls were lined with corkboards, pinned with expired notices, faded evacuation maps, and Employee of the Month photos that hadn't been updated since before the last administration. The 3rd floor housed the Department of Communications archives, where Elise worked. This floor was considered a dead zone in terms of hierarchy. Higher-ranking officials didn't linger here, and interns usually rotated through quickly, eager to be reassigned to departments that involved travel or actual human interaction. Room B107, Elise's assigned space, was tucked in the eastern wing, where only 2 functioning security cameras remained. Her windows, when not clouded by condensation, gave a view of the building's loading dock and the alley where government vehicles idled as they were loaded with documents, equipment, and sometimes people who didn't want to be seen entering through the front. The environment itself was a labyrinth of the obsolete and the neglected. Servers lined the walls of the floor below, their cooling systems barely sufficient, their network structures patchworked over decades by different teams with conflicting standards. In one room, dusty backup tapes sat in labeled bins, while in another, a blinking server rack housed communication nodes tied to now-defunct satellites. It was a strange paradox, critical infrastructure buried in bureaucratic decay, and that was precisely why Elise had taken a quiet interest in it. Forgotten systems were vulnerable systems, and vulnerable systems in the right or wrong hands became weapons. Most of her colleagues had long since stopped caring about the details. They passed around printed forms with meaningless signatures, sent emails that vanished into black holes of interdepartmental confusion, and counted down the minutes until coffee breaks or early Fridays. But Elise had always seen the floor differently. She knew that beneath the aging floorboards and flickering light fixtures were still active protocols, outdated encryption keys, and sub-networks no longer listed in the ministry's central map. These were not relics to her. They were risks and potential entry points. Her mind constantly mapped them like arteries in a forgotten body. Beyond the ministry walls, the broader world was shifting. The country had seen escalating tensions with hostile actors, rumors of cyber attacks, infrastructure tampering, and disinformation campaigns. Public broadcasts kept things calm, but within the corridors of internal reports and redacted memos, it was clear something was coming. Elise saw the warnings not in headlines, but in the changing metadata of file transfers, in the slow rise of access requests from outside contractors, in the unusual frequency of VPN reassignments. Things didn't add up. Someone, somewhere, was moving pieces on a larger board. The ministry may have been asleep, but Elise was wide awake. The culture of the workplace didn't encourage questions. Compliance was rewarded more than curiosity. Elise had once gently flagged a strange IP anomaly on an internal memo, and the response from her supervisor had been to route her inquiry to the IT help desk, which then closed the ticket with a generic, resolved message. After that, she learned not to ask. She learned to observe quietly and prepare silently. She kept her work surface clean, her browser history nondescript, and her deeper investigations hidden beneath layers of personal files that no one had reason to check. Her encryption methods were custom-built, her passwords rotated bi-weekly, and her system logs were rerouted through a local server she privately managed under the alias "archive maintenance." On days when nothing seemed to happen, Elise often walked the perimeter of her floor during her lunch break. She'd pass by forgotten rooms, one still housing old telex machines, another storing dusty filing cabinets labeled non-essential, do not destroy. One hallway led to a door with a broken biometric scanner that no one had bothered to fix. Elise had mapped these spaces in her head, not out of paranoia, but habit. Knowledge of one's environment, she believed, was the first form of power. Outside the building, the city moved at its usual pace. Government workers in gray suits swarmed into metro stations. News tickers on public monitors looped stories of economic progress and diplomatic meetings. But in the undercurrent of citywide Wi-Fi and encrypted messages, Elise knew something else lived, something quieter, darker. She monitored flagged keywords across public data streams, observed subtle changes in syntax from known adversarial domains, and occasionally stumbled upon what she called ghost threads, lines of code that didn't belong anywhere and yet traveled everywhere. They were like veins of intention, running beneath the digital skin of daily life. And lately, those veins were pulsing faster. The environment, in truth, mirrored Elise herself, overlooked, undervalued, assumed dormant, but deeply active below the surface. The ministry's decay had forced it into a kind of passivity, assuming threats came with noise and visibility. Elise knew better. Real threats were silent. They embedded themselves into routine, into assumed safety, and when they struck, They didn't announce themselves. They simply rewrote the rules and let everyone else catch up, or fall apart. In that sense, Room B-107 was more than an office. It was a watchtower no one realized existed. A place where past systems and present dangers collided. A place where Elise Navarro, tucked behind her outdated laptop, under flickering lights, was preparing to face a digital war that no one around her even knew had already begun. The man responsible for the breach Elise detected wasn't a typical hacker hiding in a basement or operating from a chaotic black market forum. He was far more deliberate and far more dangerous. Known in foreign intelligence circles by the alias Virex, he had once been a government cybersecurity architect himself, until he disappeared after a whistleblower investigation involving data manipulation and internal sabotage. Publicly disavowed, privately hunted, and officially non-existent, Virex had spent the past decade rewriting his digital identity and constructing a syndicate of operatives skilled in stealth, infiltration, and disruption. He was no longer working alone. He was a phantom leading shadows, and the goal of his current operation was simple: destabilize, reroute, and dismantle infrastructure without anyone realizing it until the damage had already collapsed the core. To the world, his actions would seem like bad timing or random errors, power outages blamed on old grids, failed military convoys attributed to miscommunication, medical delays chalked up to bureaucracy. But beneath the surface, there was a pattern. Virex was embedding false commands into outdated logistics systems still connected to military movements, though largely neglected due to overconfidence in newer digital frameworks. His method wasn't brute force. It was trust erosion. He wormed into the ignored corners of infrastructure, exploiting protocols no one had reviewed in years. And the system Elise managed, the one everyone forgot about, was one of the few left with unpatched legacy code that allowed simultaneous read-write access. A vulnerability that Virex had identified months ago. He didn't expect resistance. He had studied the Ministry of Tactical Logistics thoroughly, had charted its hierarchy, its culture, its complacency. He knew that the systems he was targeting were deemed irrelevant. He had seen the meeting notes, the budget cuts, the outsourced security patches that were never audited. He had run simulations across sandbox networks, mimicking the ministry's architecture, anticipating responses that would come hours too late. He had even set up false alarms on unrelated servers to redirect what little human oversight the ministry still maintained. In short, Virex was confident that no one would stop him, and up to that point, he had been right. The operation, codenamed Wraithline, involved the rerouting of encrypted data regarding a humanitarian convoy scheduled to depart from Base Kilo 7. The convoy carried not just aid, but embedded personnel carrying intel on a potential hostage rescue operation in a disputed territory. If the convoy followed its original path, it would intersect with an allied unit that had established temporary security. If it followed the altered route, which Virex had quietly rewritten into the old logistics protocol through a dormant communications node, it would cross directly into an ambush zone, coordinated with a local insurgent group operating under Virex's payroll. There would be no gunfire from his end, no fingerprints. Just silence, followed by confusion, followed by news reports of casualties, blame passed between departments, and delays in justice. Virex didn't deal in explosions. He dealt in consequences, in eroding trust from within until nothing functioned properly. And once the infrastructure collapsed under its own contradictions, he and his benefactors would have room to move assets, disrupt elections, and coerce alliances without ever needing to fire a shot. It was a long game, and the convoy reroute was only one piece, but it was an important one. If successful, it would not only cost lives, it would serve as a test case for future incursions into other aging systems still used across national departments worldwide. The Ministry of Tactical Logistics was just a pilot project, a low-risk experiment with high potential return. It had become a soft target in a landscape obsessed with bigger, flashier threats, and that was Virex's specialty. He knew how to make danger invisible until it was irreversible. The internal tools he used to mask his activities were state-of-the-art: modular packet scramblers, AI-generated access signatures mimicking retired employees, and a delay loop that created a 40-minute buffer between real-time detection and system logging. In simpler terms, even if someone noticed something strange, they'd be looking at a timestamp from nearly an hour prior, by which time the breach would have already adjusted itself and cleaned the trail. Elise Navarro's system, however, wasn't part of the official security network. Her ghost console, as she called it, was built on manual logic, streamline-free, unconnected to external patches, and coded with her own handwritten scripts that didn't follow standard update protocol. To an attacker like Virex, her system didn't exist. That was his first mistake. But Virex wasn't arrogant in the traditional sense. He was precise, calculated, almost detached. His operations were shaped by patterns, not emotion. He chose the ministry because it was broken. He chose that specific logistics stream because it had been marked as legacy, scheduled for retirement. He believed systems, like people, could be mapped, and that once mapped, they could be dismantled or manipulated. What he didn't account for, what his calculations couldn't measure, was someone like Elise. Not a director, not a handler, not a flashy prodigy or a well-known security consultant. Just someone with patience, pattern recognition, and a fierce sense of silent duty. Someone who didn't need permission to act, and who had already seen through the veil. The breach he initiated had been flawless on paper. He had entered through the ministry's archival node in the northeastern subnet, established a ghost connection, rerouted the pathing instructions with 3 fail-safe layers, and exited through a disguised protocol designed to mimic a weather data sync. His backdoors were time-sensitive and self-deleting. The data reroute had already occurred, and he'd already begun working on the next stage of Wraith Line, an infiltration of energy distribution protocols across Allied zones. In his mind, the convoy attack was already done, filed under success in a mental archive of untraceable victories. But at that very moment, in room B107, a woman he had never considered relevant had just located his tunnel, and she was already rewriting it. Every day at 11 a.m. sharp, Elise Navarro would stand, stretch quietly, and walk to the water dispenser 2 doors down the hall. She'd refill her bottle, nod politely to anyone she passed, then return to room B107, where she would resume typing at her desk, her fingers moving methodically as she scanned outdated logistics reports and logged minor discrepancies no one else cared to review. It was a ritual as ordinary as the building itself, but what no one realized was that behind those short walks, those sips of water, those quiet minutes by the flickering hallway lights, Elise was maintaining a pattern, her pattern, a rhythm of daily structure that let her track the subtle shifts in the system she silently monitored. She wasn't just observing data, she was listening to its heartbeat. And in recent weeks, the rhythm had been off. It started small, a timestamp in an archived transfer log that didn't match standard delivery schedules. An IP address associated with a retired contractor pinging a server that hadn't been used in over a year. Then, a protocol file in the shared logistics folder, quietly updated without being accessed by any listed user. These weren't issues that would raise alarms, at least not in a ministry that barely kept track of its own infrastructure. Most of her colleagues had long since given up trying to understand the full system architecture. The network diagrams were outdated, the labels were vague, and half the servers listed on internal maps no longer existed. If something strange happened, it was easier to ignore it than to investigate. But Elise never ignored. That was her own private ritual: daily dives into overlooked code, quiet scans of system redundancies, nightly checks on firewall logs she had mirrored to her personal drive. She maintained spreadsheets with manually flagged anomalies. She had built a visual map of the ministry's internal digital traffic using nothing more than open-source tools and intuition. It wasn't glamorous work. It was invisible, often thankless, and always assumed to be irrelevant. But to Elise, these rituals were more than routine. They were a way to stay ahead of chaos. They were her defense against the unpredictable. For months, her discoveries had followed a similar arc. Small anomalies, explainable inconsistencies, simple patches. She had even trained herself to accept that some of these glitches were just the natural consequence of a bloated bureaucracy. But something had shifted in the last 3 weeks. The errors became more elegant. The anomalies weren't random. They were sequenced, subtle, and precise. Whoever was behind them wasn't testing weaknesses. They were embedding themselves in forgotten pathways, manipulating data just enough to remain beneath the radar. And the patterns repeated at odd intervals. Every 3 days, a new anomaly. Every third anomaly, a mirrored echo on a second subnet. It wasn't just suspicious, it was deliberate. Elise knew the difference between bad code and intelligent intrusion. This wasn't incompetence, it was infiltration. She had flagged the inconsistencies once, sending a soft warning to the IT department, disguised as a routine maintenance suggestion. The response came back 3 days later, resolved, no further action needed. She hadn't expected more. She knew the department was understaffed, overworked, and increasingly dependent on automated response tools. Most cybersecurity alerts were filtered through a program called Watchport, an aging AI that prioritized only high-volume breaches or known threats. Anything subtle, anything human, slipped through the cracks. Elise stopped reporting after that. She turned inward instead. If no one else would look, she would. So she began adjusting her own rituals. She stayed an extra hour each evening, pretending to review performance audits, while quietly tracking the digital footprints left behind by the anomalies. She created new detection scripts, not based on known threat signatures, but on behavioral patterns, how the intruder moved, what they touched, what they avoided. She created a profile. She called it Spectre, not because she knew who it was, but because whoever it was moved like a ghost, always a step ahead, always erasing just enough to remain invisible. But even ghosts leave behind echoes, and Elise had trained herself to listen for echoes. Every morning before anyone else arrived, she would run a manual log check through her ghost console, reviewing the overnight activity not stored in central logs. She built a cache of recurring metadata tags, narrowed them down, and compared timestamps across parallel servers. She wasn't just reacting, she was building a case. Day by day, she was mapping a quiet war no one else even knew was happening. And in doing so, she established a ritual of defense, an evolving system that adapted to the intruder's moves. She treated the network like a chessboard, always thinking 2 moves ahead, always preparing a countermeasure. But even as she mapped the enemy's patterns, she saw a disturbing trend. The anomalies were becoming bolder. Commands were being issued directly into systems that hadn't seen active input in years. Old code was being recompiled and deployed under administrator privileges. The intruder wasn't just testing the system anymore. They were preparing for something. Elise could feel it in the way the data pulsed, controlled, rehearsed, exact. She kept it all in her private files, detailed logs, annotated scripts, timestamp screenshots. And while her coworkers breezed past her cubicle with coffee cups and idle conversation, she quietly guarded the ministry from within. This ritual, the listening, the tracking, the mapping, became her mission. And it wasn't just about protecting data anymore. It was about protecting people. Because buried in the log she reviewed 3 nights ago was something that sent a chill through her entire body, an encrypted string containing a route ID she recognized. It matched a humanitarian convoy she had seen in the scheduling reports just that morning. The convoy was listed as a routine mission: medical aid, personnel support, basic transport logistics. Nothing unusual, but the coordinates had changed. And the change wasn't logged in any official record. That was the moment her ritual shattered. The pattern she had followed for months had reached its pivot. The threat wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was operational. And it had a deadline. For the first time in years, Elise Navarro felt the weight of urgency press against her calm exterior. Her routines, her rituals, they had brought her this far. But now she would have to break them. Now the quiet watcher would have to act. Because the enemy had moved. And if she didn't respond quickly, 1,000 people would walk straight into a trap. She stared at her screen, the red ping glowing like a warning flare in the fog of routine. It was time to break the pattern. It was time to fight back. For the first time in her career, Callie felt like she was drowning. She had spent her life proving herself through results, keeping her head down, doing the work, showing up early, and staying late. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The headlines that once filled her screens with global events now blurred behind her red-rimmed eyes. Her apartment, usually spotless and orderly, was in disarray. Papers lay scattered across the floor, notes she'd written about the anomaly in the code, ideas she'd scribbled in the middle of the night, data points she thought might lead to something. All of them now meaningless in the eyes of the department. It was a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the briefing incident, and she hadn't heard a single word from Director Halston or anyone in upper command. The silence was louder than any reprimand could have been. Her badge still worked, her desk still stood in the same spot. But she had been given nothing to do. No emails, no assignments, just quiet exclusion. And in a place like Viridian's intelligence division, silence was a sentence worse than termination. She would come into the office every day, dressed in the same professional gray blazer, with her badge clipped dutifully, only to sit there like a ghost while those around her moved on. They avoided eye contact. They spoke in hushed tones when passing by her cubicle. Even the interns had started giving her sideways glances, as if her presence alone might taint their chances at advancement. Callie tried to find her footing again, throwing herself into old case files, running back through protocols, cross-referencing system logs, but without access to the command servers or security clearance to the Black Ops units. Her hands were tied. It was like she had been demoted without ceremony or explanation. One morning, she stayed in her car outside headquarters for an hour, engine off, staring blankly at the tinted windows of the building where she'd once felt proud to belong. The ache in her chest wasn't just about her career, it was something deeper. A sense that she had been right about something monumental, and no one cared. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being silenced. That evening, back at her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch, still in her work clothes, unable to find the energy to even turn on the light. The late autumn dusk bled through her windows, casting shadows across the ceiling. She closed her eyes, hoping for sleep, but what came instead was the sound of static. Not in the room, but in her mind. The kind of noise she had trained herself to hear. A frequency disturbance, subtle, inconsistent, like a signal trying to break through. She sat up slowly. Her phone was on the table beside her, still silent. No calls, no emails. But the sound in her memory lingered. It wasn't real, not in the physical sense, but it triggered something inside her. A recollection from an old audio sample buried in the Viridian archives. She got up, powered on her laptop, and pulled up her personal drive. There, tucked in a nested folder marked Irregular Archives, was a backup copy of the transmission she'd flagged weeks ago, the one that had sparked all this chaos. Her hands trembled as she hit play. Again the garbled voice filtered through her headphones, the distortion curling around syllables like smoke. She isolated the left channel, then the right, then ran a low-pass filter and narrowed the bandwidth. Suddenly she heard it. Not just random code, but a pattern. The voice wasn't just distorted. It had been deliberately masked. Someone had buried a series of navigational coordinates beneath an analog hum. And she knew immediately. This wasn't just rogue code from an amateur hacker. This was strategic, sophisticated. It wasn't a simulation. It was a directive, a live signal. She leaned forward, heart pounding. This was what she'd tried to explain in the briefing. These weren't phantom warnings. Someone was attempting to breach Viridian's satellite defenses from a remote, masked location. And no one else had noticed. Or worse, someone had noticed and wanted it buried. The next day she made the boldest move of her career. She returned to headquarters, eyes clear, spine straight. She walked past her desk, past her floor entirely, and took the elevator to level 6, where classified systems were analyzed under biometric security. Her badge should not have worked, but when she scanned it, the panel lit green. She froze. Either this was a glitch, or someone had left a door open, on purpose. Inside, the lights were dimmed. The hum of servers echoed like the breath of a sleeping dragon. She slipped into a vacant workstation and quickly uploaded her decoded audio sample. For a moment, the screen flickered. Then it displayed a map, not just of Viridian, but of multiple bases, globally connected. The coordinates pulsed. A convergence point was forming. Within days, something would happen. Something big. Something that could cost lives. Thousands of them. Callie's hands moved quickly now, faster than they had in weeks. She was going to build a firewall. Not a literal one, but a trap. A code-layered algorithm that could trace the signal back, force the source to reveal itself. But she had to move quietly. If someone had let her in, they were either a ghost ally or a ticking clock. She didn't know how long she had before this access disappeared again. This was the moment of decision. The crossroads. She could back down, let the silence consume her, let the world continue, under the illusion of safety. Or she could risk everything, her job, her freedom, maybe even her life, to follow the signal and do what no one else had the courage to. She clicked, Execute. The screen lit up with cascading streams of code. Somewhere, deep in enemy territory, someone flinched. The game had begun. The room was silent, the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from being stunned into stillness. Helena stood at the center of it, her posture as steady as ever, though every nerve in her body burned with adrenaline. Around her, the command team stared at the screen that once bore down on her like an unscalable wall. Now it displayed rows of decrypted data, troop movement logs, operation codes, and real-time communication intercepts from an enemy they had been trying to track for months. The breakthrough was undeniable. Colonel Ramirez leaned forward, mouth slightly parted, eyes darting over the screen as if trying to confirm it wasn't a mirage. But it was real. Ondid. Every second of the transmission was real. Helena had done what even the Defense Department's top cybersecurity division had failed to accomplish. She had broken through the enemy's communication firewall without alerting them. A map flickered onto the screen, pinpointing a clandestine facility in the desert region of Zarakistan, where intelligence now confirmed over 1,000 hostages were being held for use as human shields. The entire base came alive in an instant. Orders flew, teams were scrambled, helicopters prepped. The rescue operation was no longer a vague hope. It was a tangible mission. And at the center of it was the woman they had dismissed as just a secretary. Yet, even in the swirl of activity, Helena could feel the scrutiny returning, not the condescension from before, but the unnerving attention that came with being both useful and suddenly important. Ramirez approached her, no longer towering with skepticism, but with a strange reverence. He asked her, with uncharacteristic softness, if she could continue decoding the incoming data while teams were mobilized. She nodded, not because she sought praise or recognition, but because now that she had pulled one thread, she needed to unravel the whole fabric. She dove back into the data, her fingers flying over the keyboard, filtering messages, tracing patterns, annotating metadata with timestamps and geolocations. The more she dug, the clearer the picture became. There wasn't just one facility, there were 3, and only one of them was real. The others were decoys, designed to disperse attention and resources. Helena flagged this immediately. She didn't wait for anyone's permission. She routed the analysis straight to the command lead on the rescue task force, adding a brief note. This one is live. The others have ghost signatures. Confirm via satellite, but don't split forces. Ramirez reviewed the note and, without hesitation, approved her recommendation. Still, not everyone was ready to believe she could be right twice in a row. A few mid-level officers grumbled about protocol, insisting that the intelligence team re-verify everything she uncovered. But time was short. If they delayed, the enemy could relocate the hostages. Ramirez silenced the doubt, declaring, quote, "We follow her lead." That statement stunned the room even more than the data had. Helena didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Behind the screen, she was tracing outgoing signals from the enemy network, trying to find if there were any signs of a trap. There was. It was subtle, but she caught it. A scheduled communication burst, encrypted in a dead protocol from 10 years ago. Most modern analysts would have overlooked it, dismissing it as junk data. Helena saw it for what it was, a contingency trigger. If they breached the facility, the signal would activate, and explosives planted around the hostages would detonate. She flagged it instantly, then coded a pulse blocker script to send out a looped interference signal. It was risky. If the enemy detected even a hint of manipulation, they could initiate detonation manually. She ran simulations, adjusting the interference's frequency until it was virtually indistinguishable from natural background radiation. When she deployed it, no alarms were raised. They had bought themselves a window, a fragile, flickering one, but a window nonetheless. As the task force closed in on the real facility, Helena remained online with them, patching into their comms feed, monitoring sensors, running live threat assessments. She wasn't just feeding them coordinates. She was their guide, their silent guardian in the digital dark. Every second counted. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with focused urgency. She had lived most of her professional life under fluorescent lights, typing memos, organizing schedules, arranging coffee meetings. Now, she was navigating a live war zone through data streams and signal traces, and she was the only one who knew what every flicker meant. Outside the war room, the story had already begun to leak. News outlets picked up whispers of an unexpected hero behind the operation. Some mentioned an unnamed civilian analyst. Others, more dramatic, described her as a ghost in the machine. But none of it mattered to Helena. She wasn't chasing headlines, she was chasing lives, real ones. The 1,000 names that no one knew yet. The children and parents and teachers and workers who had been taken not for who they were, but because they were convenient leverage. They didn't even know she existed. But if she could succeed, they would live another day. And that was enough. Monica sat at the edge of her desk that night, her office dimly lit except for the soft blue glow of her monitor. The world outside had already gone dark, and most of the base was winding down for the night, but Monica's mind was far from resting. The security footage she had quietly copied earlier from a restricted surveillance server kept replaying in her head. A flash of uniformed figures in places they shouldn't be, flickers of classified documents being accessed, audio logs that didn't match the official time-stamped reports. The anomalies were subtle, so subtle that someone without her meticulous nature would have missed them entirely, but they were there, and they told a story far more dangerous than anyone seemed to realize. Monica wasn't just uncovering incompetence or a breach of protocol, she was beginning to suspect a mole. Worse yet, someone high up in the chain of command could be feeding information to the enemy. And if her instincts were right, the scheduled humanitarian supply drop set for the following week might be walking straight into a death trap. But proving this theory was going to require more than intuition. She needed something irrefutable, so Monica dug deeper. She scoured internal logs, traced IP activity, and cross-referenced security access timestamps against staff assignments. Her years spent managing office records gave her a bird's-eye view of the base's movements, and she began seeing patterns others wouldn't have noticed. For instance, a maintenance officer who regularly swiped into the server room during times he was supposedly on leave, or a junior intelligence analyst who accessed outgoing communications logs far beyond his clearance. None of it made sense until she layered their activity over the spike in intercepted Allied operations in the field, supply routes ambushed, safe houses compromised, digital surveillance blackouts occurring with disturbing precision. The connections weren't just eerie, they were damning. She started keeping her findings in a hidden subdirectory on a removable drive she now carried around her neck like a talisman. Her instincts screamed that if she left it anywhere in the system, even password protected, it would disappear. At this stage, Monica wasn't sure who she could trust. Even her supervisor, Colonel Harris, a man she had once admired for his integrity and leadership, had started acting strangely. Their last interaction, where he'd given her that icy, clipped warning about stepping outside her lane, hadn't left her mind. The message was clear: stay in your place or face the consequences. But something in her had shifted. For the first time in her life, Monica wasn't going to shrink back into the safety of smallness. The stakes were too high. 1,000 lives hung in the balance. She decided to speak with someone she trusted, a low-profile communications specialist named Theo Park. Theo had no ambitions for glory or advancement. He was sharp, quiet, and had a knack for decrypting data faster than most. They had shared coffee breaks and casual chats over system bugs for months. Monica hoped that trust extended deeper. When she approached him the next day, she kept it vague at first. She asked about security backdoors in the comms grid and hypothetical data leaks. Theo, ever perceptive, saw right through it. He asked if this had anything to do with the drop next week. That was all Monica needed. She took a risk and showed him just enough to make him understand. His face paled as he read through her files, and his normally cool demeanor cracked. He looked up and said, "Monica, if this is true, they're not just leaking. They're orchestrating. From inside." Together they worked in secret for 3 nights, combing through deeper layers of the system, following encrypted trails that led them to unauthorized outbound communications. One particular relay had been cloaked using old NATO protocols, a clever move meant to mask its presence among harmless chatter. Theo cracked it. What they found sent chills down Monica's spine. Detailed coordinates of the drop zone, timestamps, movement logs of the convoy units, and tactical schematics. Everything the enemy would need to ambush the operation flawlessly. And the signature embedded in the data? It traced back to Colonel Harris himself. Monica wanted to scream. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to understand how a man entrusted with national security could betray them all. But Theo stopped her. He reminded her of what they were up against. Going directly to the colonel or even alerting internal affairs could tip him off. If they wanted to save the convoy, they needed to work quietly, strategically. That's when Monica made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would hack into the satellite network herself, reroute the drop zone coordinates, and replace them with a decoy, one she could monitor and control. That way, if the mole took the bait, they would know for certain, and the real convoy could be redirected in time. It was a dangerous gamble. One mistake could expose her. But it was the only way to save those lives. Theo handled the encryption layers while Monica manually spoofed the satellite data entries through the legacy system backdoor she had once accidentally discovered months ago. It was sloppy and outdated, long since patched officially, but this base still had old architecture in parts of the system. That mistake had made her the office joke for weeks. Now, it would save 1,000 lives. They worked all night. Sweat clung to Monica's back, her fingers aching, her eyes raw from staring at the screen. She forgot about being tired. She forgot about being afraid. All she could think about was getting the data uploaded, checked and executed before Harris, or whoever he worked with, discovered what she was doing. At 4:12 a.m. it was done. The coordinates were replaced. The new data would go live in 8 hours, just before the final flight plan was locked. The convoy would never know they had been rerouted. But the enemy? They would arrive at an empty field. Surrounded by surveillance drones Monica had already queued up to deploy from a nearby recon outpost. It wasn't just a rescue mission now. It was a trap. And Monica was the bait. Amid the dimming skies of another clouded day, the air inside the base grew thick with tension, not because of gunfire or aircraft, but from the kind of tension that brewed in quiet rooms when people knew something critical was about to happen and had no clue what that something would be. Evelina had spent most of the night cross-referencing the fragments of code she had extracted from the enemy firewall breach. What she found was not just concerning, it was horrifying. The messages hidden in the digital architecture weren't just logs or encrypted instructions. They were countdowns, and the timestamps all pointed to the same moment, 48 hours from now. She didn't know what exactly the payload was, but whatever it was massive, coordinated, and global. She didn't wait for approval. She stormed into the strategy briefing room that morning, interrupting General Rourke and his staff mid-discussion. Faces turned. Her presence was unexpected, and even now, despite all she had uncovered, some eyes still carried that glint of condescension. But Evelina had stopped caring. She had stopped shrinking. She laid her stack of printed data on the war table, looked directly at Rourke, and said flatly, "There's a coordinated attack being launched in less than 48 hours. If we don't move now, thousands, maybe more, will die." There was a heavy pause in the room, the kind of silence that falls not from disbelief, but from the weight of realization. Rourke, to his credit, didn't dismiss her. Not anymore. He signaled the tech team and the analysts to verify the data. It didn't take them long to confirm the timestamps, the digital signatures, the unmistakable patterns. A series of localized blackouts, satellite disruptions, and military base interferences, each scheduled like dominoes meant to fall in perfect rhythm. This wasn't just cyber warfare. This was infrastructural collapse, aimed to destabilize regions, spark chaos, and leave countless lives exposed. The code bore the signature of SPECTER-7, a rogue militant cyber faction known for merciless, large-scale sabotage. Spectre-7 had been on their radar for years, but no one had ever gotten this close to their operational core. Until Evelina. What followed was chaos. Not the destructive kind, but the kind where people sprint through hallways with folders in hand, coffee left forgotten on tables, radios buzzing on every frequency, the entire base switching into emergency coordination mode. At the center of it all stood Evelina. She wasn't just the messenger now, she was the key. Her intimate understanding of the enemy system architecture, the pathways she'd navigated, the firewalls she'd bypassed, they made her more valuable than any field agent. General Rourke placed her on direct liaison with the Emergency Response Tech Division, giving her full access to tactical systems, an unprecedented move. Word of her elevation spread through the base faster than the actual intel. She wasn't just a secretary anymore, she was the specialist. The protector, the one person who had seen the storm before it made landfall. And she worked like a woman possessed, no sleep, no rest. She coordinated with 6 separate regional units across different time zones, each with unique vulnerabilities. Her voice filled command centers as she walked defense teams through patch implementations and system overhauls. In one tense instance, a base in southern Nigeria reported an unresponsive satellite link. She talked their tech officer through a manual rerouting protocol she had never formally trained for but somehow instinctively understood. It worked. That base's system stayed online. In another case, a humanitarian supply center in coastal Misira had their communications jammed, a precursor to disruption. Evelina coordinated a cloaked network relay using an outdated Cold War-era satellite link buried in the archives, something no one else had remembered even existed. The convoy reached its destination. People were fed, water was delivered, and panic was avoided. But time was slipping. One major node remained vulnerable, a NATO-aligned base on the outskirts of northern terrain. According to the data, this would be Spectre-7's primary strike point, the linchpin in their plan to destabilize the sector. If this base fell, the entire defense network in the region would splinter, and thousands of civilian and military lives would hang in the balance. Evelina requested clearance to initiate a preemptive counterhack, something technically classified as offensive cyber warfare, a line rarely crossed without diplomatic sanction. Rourke hesitated. It could be seen as provocation. But Evelina argued it wasn't provocation if it was the only way to save lives. She didn't ask to lead the team. She demanded it. Rourke looked at her, saw the same fire in her eyes that had once lit up quietly from the corner desk, and nodded. Authorization was granted. She assembled a team of cyber tacticians, most of them more experienced on paper, but now fully aware of who was in charge. Under her command, they launched what would later be called Operation Mercury Veil. It was a daring, high-stakes intrusion into the heart of Spectre 7's command interface. They traced IP masks, flooded false port data, bounced across encrypted servers, until finally, Evelina herself found the entry point. One mistake would have triggered a digital landmine, but she didn't flinch. She slipped in, bypassed their dynamic proxy, and reached their control board. There, she discovered the kill switch, a command sequence that, once activated, would detonate cascading shutdowns and malware into infrastructure systems. With shaking fingers, she wrote and executed a counterscript that rerouted their own trigger through a containment loop, effectively reversing the payload and erasing their primary weapon code. Spectre 7's system went dark, not just for a moment but permanently. The network crumbled from within, their strike failed. The countdown stopped, lives were spared, and in that moment, somewhere in the silence of a war room filled with gasps and cheers, someone whispered what many had once scoffed at. She was just a secretary. No longer. Now, Evelina Marin was the reason over 1,000 families slept in peace that night. And she was only getting started. The storm that followed was not a sudden one. It was slow, creeping, and cold, like an invisible fog of distrust seeping through the cracks of the Citadel's once solid walls. After Ava's unauthorized but undeniably successful infiltration into the echelon grid, the chain of command began rattling with unease. The lives saved, nearly 1,000, were becoming statistics in political maneuverings rather than heroic outcomes in mission reports. And although Colonel Reinhardt gave Ava a nod and a quietly issued commendation, there was a tension in his jaw that Ava couldn't ignore. She was no longer invisible, but being seen came with consequences. Ava tried to return to her usual duties, scheduling meetings, coordinating secure transmissions, typing out action plans dictated by others, but her work had changed. People paused when they passed her desk now. Some saluted, some whispered, and some stared like they didn't know whether to thank her or fear her. The secretary, who had once been overlooked, had become a symbol, and symbols in wartime were double-edged. Even those who admired her started asking questions. Who trained her? What else did she know? Was she sanctioned? And those questions filtered upward until they landed squarely in the hands of the Defense Oversight Council. Word spread that an internal review was underway, and Ava found herself summoned to briefings that were no longer about logistics or field reports, but about her background, her skills, her unsanctioned access to high-level systems. It wasn't a trial, but it felt close. Commander Luthra, one of the few brass-level officials who had always treated Ava with respectful indifference, suddenly became the voice of scrutiny. He questioned not just her actions but her presence in the Citadel at all. Her personnel file was laid bare. No military academy, no field training, just top of class from a state university, and a quiet rise through administrative channels. Yet somehow she had cracked one of the most heavily guarded enemy networks in modern warfare. It didn't add up to them, but it did to Ava, because what they didn't understand was that her strength had never come from traditional structures. It came from curiosity, persistence, and a kind of problem-solving fluency that couldn't be taught in drills or lectures. It came from years of being underestimated, which gave her the freedom to observe, to test, to learn, without spotlight or suspicion. And now that she had used those skills in a way that changed the trajectory of an entire battalion, those same systems that ignored her wanted to cage her. But Ava wasn't angry. Not yet. What surprised her more than anything was the sense of disappointment. After everything, after saving lives, proving her worth in the most direct and meaningful way possible, she thought perhaps things would change. Not just for her, but for people like her. Quiet minds in loud rooms, hidden talent, invisible roles. But the machinery of war didn't evolve overnight. And despite her impact, there were those who still saw her as a deviation, not an example. When she left the review room one morning, after an especially grueling session that felt more like interrogation than inquiry, she found a note waiting at her desk. A single line, typed and unsigned. They fear what they don't control. She folded it, tucked it into her pocket, and said nothing. But she felt the pulse of it in her chest. Days later, she was reassigned. Officially, it was a, quote, temporary rotation to the Tactical Strategy Office, a supposed promotion. Unofficially, it was exile. She was moved to a windowless unit on Sublevel 4, far from the war rooms, far from the data hubs, far from the soldiers she had helped save. The work was abstract, scenario modeling, supply chain hypotheticals, forecasting reports that never saw the front lines. It was all spreadsheets and no impact. Ava could feel herself fading back into the margins. But something had shifted in her. The version of herself that once accepted being overlooked was gone. She didn't want a spotlight, but she refused to disappear. So she did what she had always done. She watched. She listened. She traced the data. And in that quiet, dusty room 3 floors underground, she began noticing patterns. Shipment logs that didn't align. Maintenance records that were overly sanitized. Encryption protocols subtly altered. It was faint, scattered, almost imperceptible. But to Ava's trained eye, it smelled like sabotage. And it wasn't coming from the enemy. It was inside. She double-checked, cross-referenced, and ran silent queries through legacy systems, avoiding the monitored channels. What she uncovered was staggering. Falsified requisition orders, internal reroutes of high-grade surveillance tech, and hidden code buried deep in the network that acted like a siphon, feeding information outward, not into enemy hands exactly, but into a blind spot in the system. Someone within the Citadel was feeding data into the dark. Ava realized, with a slow chill moving down her spine, that the mission she had thought was behind her, the one that saved 1,000 lives, might have just scratched the surface of something much deeper. The enemy system wasn't the only one with vulnerabilities. Her own house had cracks in its foundation. And if what she was seeing was correct, the infiltration she had uncovered might not have been an isolated breach. It might have been a test run. A dry run. A precursor to something bigger. She stared at the blinking cursor on her screen, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Reporting it through official channels might mean having her access revoked again, or worse, buried before action could be taken. She needed proof. Real proof. And she needed a plan. One thing was clear. The war Ava thought she had already fought was still raging. Only now, the battlefield was inside. And this time, the enemy wasn't marked in red. It wore the same uniform she did. When Celia stepped into the data vault that night, the hum of servers and the cold fluorescent glow cast long shadows on the metal walls. But she wasn't thinking about the intimidating hardware or the endless blinking lights. She was thinking about the 1,000 lives hanging in the balance. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she slid into the chair, the keycard from Dae Kim still warm in her pocket. She booted up the secured terminal, and a prompt for biometric access flashed on the screen. She had prepared for this. She had studied every bypass, every override Dae had shown her. Her eyes darted to the camera in the corner of the room, standard surveillance. But she knew from her last quiet coffee with Dae that this sector had a 20-minute blind spot when the backup servers cycled. She had 19 minutes left. She entered the first override code and pressed Enter. Nothing happened for a beat. Then, The screen flickered, lines of code racing across, and the interface she wasn't supposed to see unfolded like a dark web. She was in. Her pulse quickened, but she forced her breath to remain steady. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a small, portable drive, the one she had encrypted herself using a layer that even Day hadn't been able to crack fully. If they failed, no one would be able to trace the leak. If they succeeded, the data would erase itself the moment it reached the satellite relay. Celia connected the drive. There was a faint whir, then a prompt. Destination? Her fingers hovered over the keys before typing in the code for a decryption shell, something she'd built quietly at home over the past few weeks, under the guise of clerical overtime. Then she routed the information toward a civilian satellite node in South Jakarta, far outside the military's radar. She began pulling the files. The logs came up first: flight schedules, personnel movements, classified air routes. But those weren't what she needed. She drilled deeper. And then she found it. Project Echelon. A deeply buried directive, hidden behind 4 layers of nested directories. She tapped into it, and the contents chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just a prisoner transfer or a convoy. It was a purge order. A full-scale Black Ops mission designed to eliminate a civilian resistance stronghold that intelligence had labeled quote, 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 quote. The so-called resistance was a community of educators, doctors, aid workers, and techies, people whose only crime was leaking truths to the world that made the government look bad. 1,000 lives, children, parents, volunteers, scheduled to be wiped out in 3 days. Their location had been mapped. Drones were already en route. Celia's stomach turned, but she didn't flinch. She copied everything: timetables, kill orders, authorization signatures, drone paths. The entire operation wrapped into one tight package of damning truth. She compressed it and began the upload. 12 minutes remained. Her eyes didn't leave the screen. Line by line, the files moved to the satellite node. At 43%, the screen blinked. An alert popped up. Unauthorized transfer detected. Her breath caught. Someone had noticed. Maybe not yet physically, but some protocol was sniffing the movement. She couldn't abort now. She overrode the warning, doubling the upload speed. The processors groaned. At 71%, a second alert triggered. Access logs were being reviewed. She had 5 minutes, max. She glanced at the drive. The files were nearly done. Her hand reached into her coat pocket and pressed the button on a small device, a jammer. It wouldn't hold back the entire base's monitoring, but it would delay them just enough to slow the log syncs. At 100%, she hit execute on the erase protocol. The drive began self-wiping. On screen, the last confirmation flickered. Transfer complete. Relay engaged. Package delivered. She pulled the drive and pocketed it, then closed every shell she had opened, resetting the environment to look like a routine diagnostics test. She stood up, adrenaline washing over her like a cold tide, and walked briskly down the corridor. Behind her, lights flashed yellow. Someone had triggered a level 2 scan. She reached the elevator and pressed down. 30 seconds of holding her breath. When the doors opened, she slipped inside and descended to the maintenance floor. If she exited through the front, she'd be stopped. But Day had shown her a maintenance tunnel exit, forgotten and unguarded at night. She walked through the dimly lit corridor, the sound of distant alarms faint through the reinforced walls. She pushed through a side door into a narrow hallway, ducked under low-hanging wires, and followed the map she'd memorized. One wrong turn and she'd be caught. One camera not blind, and her cover would be blown. But step by step, she moved with a quiet certainty. The kind that came from knowing you were doing something bigger than yourself. She emerged into the cool night air behind a loading dock. The moonlight shimmered on wet asphalt. She didn't run. Running drew attention. She walked calmly, head down, until she reached a parked maintenance truck where Day was waiting. He said nothing, just looked at her, then at her empty hands. She gave a nod. His eyes flickered with awe and a kind of fear. Wordlessly, he started the engine. They drove into the night. Celia didn't look back. Somewhere above them, the satellite was relaying the files to a global watchdog network. Somewhere else, an operator was seeing the orders for the first time. And somewhere far from both of those places, 1,000 people were sleeping unaware that a quiet woman in a gray blazer had just saved them from death. Celia leaned back against the cold window, heart racing, mind blank, but her spirit, for the first time in years, felt unchained. The hours leading up to the planned operation felt like the air was tightening around every corner of the command center. Ever since Mallory had made the impossible breakthrough and unlocked the encrypted enemy node, the room had taken on a different energy, not one of relief, but of restrained anticipation. It was the kind of hush that came before the world either broke into celebration or burned to ash. Every officer, technician, and strategist knew that what was coming next depended entirely on the accuracy of the intel Mallory had pulled. At the same time, no one dared to admit aloud that this information hadn't come from a career spy, a trained analyst, or a battle-hardened general. It came from someone they'd once called just a secretary. Mallory, however, was not thinking about glory. She wasn't thinking about changing perceptions or proving anyone wrong anymore. She was focused. Focused like someone who had already lost too much and was determined not to let another innocent die under her watch. She barely slept the night before the assault. Her mind played scenarios over and over, thinking through what variables might go wrong, what missteps might be hiding in the layers of decoded plans she had uncovered. She pored over satellite maps, compared timestamps, lined up communication patterns from the enemy's chatter with their known behaviors in the past. She second-guessed herself, then corrected, reviewed, revised, and validated again. The fate of 1,000 lives rested on whether or not she had made a single miscalculation. By morning, the team was assembled. Commander Rayburn, who now deferred to Mallory with a humility no one had ever seen before, stood at the front of the mission room with a digital map projected on the wall. The screen displayed a remote mountain pass between the fictional border towns of Nalkov and Hemrit, where an enemy caravan disguised as humanitarian aid was expected to pass through, carrying explosives and armed mercenaries under the radar. Their goal was a mass civilian gathering in the nearby capital, one that would have been an unguarded, defenseless target, but thanks to Mallory's discovery, they were ready. As she stood to the side of the room, quietly watching soldiers prepare themselves to intercept the caravan, Mallory felt an unfamiliar heat rise in her chest. It was not panic. It was not doubt. It was responsibility, carried not as a burden, but as a badge. These people were trusting her judgment, her quiet persistence, her unglamorous knowledge of code, protocol, and patterns. She had never fired a weapon in her life, yet her fingers on a keyboard had just armed an entire team with the one thing they always needed more than bullets: foresight. The operation commenced at 0600 hours. Aerial surveillance tracked the convoy's movements as it curved down the narrow pass. Units moved in strategic positions to cut off exit routes and surround the caravan with minimal civilian risk. The plan was surgical, clean, swift, efficient. Mallory watched it all unfold through live feeds and incoming reports. The convoy, exactly as she had predicted, matched the route, timing, and personnel outlined in the decoded data. The weapons were real. The disguises were convincing. Had they not been stopped, the death toll would have been catastrophic. The enemy was stunned. They had no idea they had been found out. Most were captured alive. Several tried to detonate emergency triggers, but were disabled before they could act. And just like that, the operation ended, not with fire and blood, but with a quiet that came only when a threat had been truly neutralized. When the reports confirmed the success, and the estimated lives saved exceeded the 1,000 mark, the command center erupted in a kind of awe. Not celebration, at least not yet, but the kind of stunned silence that follows an act so precise and vital that people struggle to comprehend how it even happened. And then eyes slowly turned toward Mallory, not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but because they all knew. The mission might have had a commanding officer, but its victory belonged to her. Still, Mallory didn't smile. Her hands rested on the sides of the table. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. She simply said, "Let's make sure no one forgets how close we came." Then she walked out of the room, head held high, word spread. In the hours that followed, the Director of Operations submitted an official commendation request. News reached the intelligence brass overseas, and high-ranking officials began asking questions, not about what had happened, but who had made it possible. For the first time, Mallory's name was spoken not with casual dismissal or amusement, but with respect. True, earned, profound respect. But the moment that hit the hardest wasn't the applause or the handshake from the commander. It came later that evening, long after the mission had been logged and the headlines had started to change. She received an encrypted message, anonymous, likely from a soldier in the field. It read only, "My sister was at that rally. She's safe. You saved her. Thank you." Mallory stared at the message, the screen glowing faintly in the darkened office. She hadn't asked for thanks. She hadn't expected acknowledgement. But in that quiet moment, something finally clicked in her heart. She realized that this wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving herself right, that even the overlooked could be indispensable, that even a so-called secretary could rewrite the fate of a nation if someone just gave her the keyboard. Camille's fingers hovered just above the keyboard, sweat lining her palms despite the chilled air in the server room. The dual monitors in front of her lit up her face in a bluish hue, casting deep shadows across her cheekbones and jawline. Lines of code streamed down in real time, her custom scripts already worming their way into the data vault of the Duran Syndicate's encrypted command node. Her breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest as she mentally blocked out the world and dove headfirst into the digital battlefield. Every keystroke was deliberate, every command born of a calculated risk. Around her, the base at Fort Ainslie buzzed with tension, its personnel unaware that right below their feet, in a forgotten corner of the old tech wing, a secretary, labeled insignificant, was potentially disarming one of the most dangerous paramilitary threats in the Northern Hemisphere. The data she had retrieved over the past week through a series of trial-and-error stealth hacks, exploiting overlooked authentication loopholes, repurposing junk data caches, and riding barely noticed packet leaks, had painted a terrifying picture. The syndicate had not only embedded agents into civilian infrastructure across 4 major cities, but they had installed failsafes that could trigger coordinated detonations. But what chilled her most was the manifest. It wasn't just weapons. They had biotoxins stored beneath a converted farming complex near the border of Tescara. If that data was true, and she had little doubt it was, then the casualties from a single breach could eclipse anything the nation had ever known. She needed that master override key embedded somewhere in the Syndicate's command matrix, a mythical backdoor rumored to be a failsafe for internal control, but no intel had ever confirmed its existence. Until now. Camille leaned forward and tightened her focus, whispering the paths aloud in her mind. The trapdoor function she found buried in the Syndicate's custom-built OS pointed to a shell program named Rook, deeply disguised as a routine security check, but seemingly connected to the central neural net of their regional servers. Most would have dismissed it. She didn't. Years of organizing field notes, aligning timelines, and learning system behaviors by proxy had taught her to see patterns where others couldn't. She had tracked Rook's pings and found an anomaly, It only activated when regional commanders logged in from a specific terminal in Farrenport, roughly 200 miles away. That's where the override had to be. And if she could simulate the same terminal environment and mirror its security footprint, she might just trick the system into handing over the skeleton key. The process wasn't elegant. She scrounged firmware data from a discarded bootloader, rebuilt the terminal's identifier from compromised surveillance server logs, and coded an environment clone that fooled her own virtual sandbox. When she launched it, her entire system went dark for 3 seconds. She thought she had crashed everything, until a blinking cursor reappeared with a single line: "Enter command-level authorization." She typed slowly, inputting what she believed to be the code string based on decrypted leader correspondence she'd stitched together like puzzle pieces. Silence. Then, another prompt. "Override sequence initialized. Warning, all failsafes are now inactive." Her stomach turned. This was it. This wasn't just digital gamesmanship anymore. Any wrong move from here on out could trigger automated countermeasures. Or worse, alert the syndicate to her breach, leading them to accelerate the attack. But waiting was no longer an option. Her clock was ticking. The field team, led by Colonel Harrow and including over 50 elite responders, was en route to intercept the syndicate's distribution compound in Tezcara. They were flying in blind, hoping to intercept a chemical payload with no real confirmation it even existed. If she could gain full access, she could disarm the payloads remotely, or at least reroute the drones meant to distribute them. She entered the next string of commands, and another interface unfolded. A node tree showing dozens of active zones, blinking in red and amber. Camille zoomed in on the Tezcara grid. 3 drone stations active, 2 already in warm-up phase. She launched her reroute script, pulling from years-old drone control manuals she had memorized back when she helped edit logistics reports during her secretary-only days. One by one, the drone stations flickered yellow, then green. Her script had taken. The drones were now programmed to divert to an isolated salt flat just miles outside of Tezcara's outskirts. She couldn't deactivate them entirely. Such commands required physical override, but she could reroute them to buy time. A message pinged from her encrypted terminal. It was Field Ops. Target confirmed. Breach in 30 minutes. She had half an hour. That's when she noticed something else. A hidden relay point deep in the rook tree, marked only as ECHO7. No location, no traffic, just a heartbeat signal. She pulled logs. It had been dormant for 12 years, until 2 days ago. Her eyes widened. It wasn't a node, it was a person. A living handler still tethered to the syndicate's early infrastructure, acting as a human failsafe. She had to find out who they were. If the syndicate knew someone was breaching their systems, Echo 7 would be the one authorized to pull the plug. Or worse, retaliate. Her hands flew across the keyboard again, this time with a new goal. Camille wasn't just hacking now, she was racing a ghost. And whoever Echo 7 was, they were about to learn that the woman everyone called just a secretary was now the syndicate's most dangerous threat. The room was silent except for the low hum of servers and the faint beeping of security alarms that still hadn't been reset. Nadia sat hunched over the terminal, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard, her eyes locked on the screen as data streamed in like a torrent. Every byte that passed by told a story: routes, patterns, encrypted signals, intercepted commands. Somewhere buried in that stream was the final piece of the puzzle that would confirm her deepest suspicion. As she decrypted the last of the corrupted files, her pulse quickened. She wasn't just dealing with a rogue military faction or a cyber-terrorist cell. This was bigger. The IP backtraces and spoofed relays pointed to a much more centralized authority. The attacks had been sanctioned, not by the enemy nation alone, but with knowledge and cover from shadow groups embedded within allied diplomatic networks. A planned, false flag operation. Nadia sat back for a second, stunned. The convoy of civilians scheduled to evacuate tomorrow morning wasn't just in the crosshairs by accident. They were bait. The intention was to let the convoy get hit, blame it on the usual suspects, then launch a full-scale retaliatory strike as a show of force. It would start a war that would engulf millions. Suddenly, it wasn't just about saving 1,000 lives. It was about stopping the next global conflict before it began. Her screen blinked again, this time with a prompt. Remote access request granted. Miles away, in a data bunker beneath the South Luzaria command base, 2 junior engineers had finally managed to reroute Nadia's backdoor request through a legacy fail-safe protocol embedded during an earlier software upgrade she had authored. It was something no one else had thought to check because no one else knew it existed. She had left herself a secret key to override fail-safes in the system, something she had never planned to use until now. Within seconds, the war room map that had shown red for danger flickered green as she rerouted the convoy path through a lesser-known passage in the Siradhan range, far from where the drone strike had been scheduled. She fed false location signals to the enemy's targeting system, masking the actual position of the evacuees with a series of false pings bouncing across old satellites. Meanwhile, she initiated a code injection, disguised as a maintenance update, into the enemy's fire command queue, rendering the targeting software temporarily blind to any new orders. She had bought them time. But time wasn't enough. Nadia knew they'd eventually trace the breach, scrub the injected commands, and recalibrate their systems. She had to take it a step further. Using the compromised channel, she began scraping every last bit of intel about the instigators behind the plot. She compiled dossiers, downloaded voice records, intercepted emails, all digitally signed and time-stamped by the very individuals sitting in positions of power across embassies and defense coalitions. Hallos, it was damning evidence. By the time her console blinked transfer complete, she had in her possession everything needed to expose the conspiracy. But just as she was preparing to package the files for secure transmission to the whistleblower hub she had once helped design, a sharp static crackled through the speakers above her. The intercom system, thought to be disabled, came alive. A cold, calculated voice rang through the hall. "Ms. Verano, step away from the terminal. This is a secure operation now under Level 1 lockdown. You are in violation of sovereign protocol." She froze. Cameras, they had seen her. Within seconds, a red alert washed over the entire room, steel shutters slamming down over exit points. She was locked in. She had known it was a risk, but the sound of metal on metal still sent a jolt through her. Nadia pivoted immediately. There was no time to panic. Instead of wasting seconds on escape plans, she did what she was trained to do. She covered her tracks. She triggered a sequence that wiped her temporary access points, salted the metadata, and corrupted the timestamps. Then she ran a final command that split the file dump into encrypted packets, bouncing them through multiple VPN tunnels before being uploaded onto a decentralized blockchain-based whistleblower archive. With a final keystroke, she engaged the fail-safe self-destruct protocol for her terminal. Nothing explosive, just enough to burn out the motherboard and render the device useless. Just as the heavy boots echoed down the corridor toward the command room, she stepped away from the smoldering machine, arms raised, heart pounding. The doors burst open and armed personnel stormed in. Nadia was calm, collected, but her eyes scanned each of their faces. Not for fear. For confirmation. Some of them were just doing their jobs. Others she recognized from those intercepted emails. Their panic wasn't about a trespasser. It was about what she might have sent. What she might have exposed. As they detained her, zip-tied her wrists, and began their scripted interrogation, she said nothing. Not a word. Because she knew that somewhere out there, journalists were already receiving pieces of the story. The file had been labeled with her call sign, Tessiera 07. The same identifier she had once used in a classified test op to simulate ethical warfare protocols. That name had long since faded from military records, but it was now the name being attached to a digital bombshell that would unravel the plot exonerate the convoy's real mission, and trigger international inquiry. Nadia didn't need to scream or plead. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. They had called her just a secretary. But as the gears of the machine she had just jammed ground to a halt, the world would soon know better. The morning sun crept slowly over the skyline of Cerberus as the city stirred to life, unaware of just how close it had come to destruction. In a high-ceiling conference hall now converted into a command operations center, Yvonne sat at the edge of a long steel table, her once red hair now streaked with the pale silver of sleepless nights and hard-earned wisdom. Her eyes scanned the digital wall of status updates, recovery progress bars, and evacuation metrics. The crisis was officially over, and the ripple effect of her actions was still expanding across agencies, nations, and public consciousness. Yvonne Reyes, once dismissed as just a secretary, had become a name spoken with reverence among the ranks of world leaders and intelligence circles. Yet as accolades poured in, Yvonne stayed quiet, composed, and focused, only ever truly reacting when she saw the most important figure to her, her mother, Carmen, rushing toward her with tears in her eyes and trembling hands. That embrace was worth more than every medal that would follow. Later that afternoon, during a press conference streamed across every major network, General Archer stood in full uniform, flanked by Prime Minister Yeager and the head of cybersecurity operations. Cameras clicked, and reporters leaned in with anticipation as the general cleared his throat and spoke plainly. This war was not won by drones, missiles, or brute force. It was won by intelligence, heart, and extraordinary courage. It was won because one woman refused to be defined by her title. Then, turning to gesture toward her, he said the words that would echo across the headlines for weeks. It was won because Yvonne Reyes didn't ask for permission to be great. She just was. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Yvonne's thoughts drifted not to the clapping crowd, but to her tiny desk back at the administrative wing, the old keyboard with the missing H key, the tin of lemon candies she always kept tucked beside her monitor. Heibel, that life, that version of her, seemed a world away now. But even in this new role, recruited as a senior cybersecurity strategist for an elite international task force, she carried every memory with her, every belittling remark, every glance that overlooked her, and every late night she spent learning code and protocol systems not because anyone told her to, but because she felt she could. Those moments were now the foundation of a new era not only for her, but for every underestimated soul who dared to be more than what the world expected. She knew the headlines would fade eventually, the documentaries would be made and forgotten, and the interviews would be archived into some digital vault. But the lives saved, 1,032 to be exact, from the redirected subway routes, to the neutralized warehouse bombs, to the intercepted hospital contamination plans, those lives were real. Mothers tucked in their children. Soldiers came home. Hospitals continued running. Families were spared grief. And she had played a part in that. A real, undeniable part. In the weeks that followed, she began mentoring young women from across the region who showed potential in tech, coding, or cybersecurity. Some were former assistants, some were dropout students, some were single mothers looking to transition into a more stable career. Yvonne made sure they had not only training and access, but belief, something she had gone without for far too long. Her first mentee, a girl named Lyra, had tears in her eyes when Yvonne told her she'd never be just anything if she kept learning, trying, and believing that her voice mattered. The resonance of Yvonne's legacy extended beyond technology and tactics. It infiltrated boardrooms where old men who once chuckled at the mention of administrative staff now added cybersecurity training to all onboarding roles. It transformed government hiring protocols, adding anonymous review layers to reduce bias and increase recognition of unconventional talents. It pushed school systems to consider equal funding for digital skills training alongside traditional academics. And all of it started because a quiet, overlooked woman refused to stay silent. On the anniversary of Operation Turncoat, a modest marble monument was unveiled in front of the Cerberus Central Terminal, one of the original targets of the attack. It bore no statue, just a rectangular pillar inscribed with one quote in steel lettering. "She didn't need permission, she just saved us. Anonymous." But everyone knew. Yvonne visited the monument once, alone, at dusk. She didn't linger. She simply placed a small lemon candy at the base and whispered something only the wind heard. Then she turned and walked away, not into the shadows, but toward the next challenge. For the woman once called just a secretary had become a force of nature, and the world, now wide awake, would never again underestimate the quiet ones with fire in their minds and courage in their hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.